In the age of sequels, people usually ask the question, when does it end? Because really, nothing ever ends anymore, and that's something we have to accept, just like in the age of Toy Story's endless existence. But Toy Story 4, its memeable continuation, produces consistent high-quality storytelling that still is heartwarming and charming to unite all generations of those who watch it. And because of recent times of how Toy Story now has 5 films or more if they choose, I just think it's better to revisit the past yet again, knowing what I know now, which involves all of the films in some degree, but obviously title-wise relates to Toy Story 4 yet again. I mean, I thought this would be a good start to revitalize things back here since I've been taking a long break, understanding what kind of content I want to revolve around, and the best path forward in growth is to look back on the past that has already been done. Yes, I know it's a bit redundant to do something you speak about again, but nothing really is ever final, just like these series we've talked about again, where one has to note, within the context of another film, I have certainly softened my stance against the recent Toy Story films, where in fact it has rather made me appreciate it better for any and all reasons. Because the dominant feeling of Toy Story 4 after its release, of when I first made my opinions known about it, was that it was a good film like all the others, but how the circumstances were rather disappointing or initially contradictory to the right characters. You know, how the characters were shaped towards rather than being the coherent narrative that the original trilogy put us on. Again, that was never to say that Toy Story 4 was a bad film. Far from it, where if you think that way, you might have had a problem with it originally, but that's okay because no one really has to either like or dislike a film, and there are still valid criticisms that remain. However, when time rolls around, things must be reevaluated, especially when this film is over 7 years old, which in turn, one day this video itself will be 7 years old. A gap that allows us to process things more harder, since yet another Toy Story film exists. Because when we go back to Toy Story 4, the plot is relatively simple. It takes place long after Andy's long gone, with the gang being settled into being Bonnie's toys that we know of, but how she moves up in life that requires new feelings amongst the crew. Especially Woody, who struggles to find purpose since Bonnie doesn't value playing with him often, which sets this journey off with the creation of Forky and valuing such new toys for owners. Paired also with the return of Bo Peep after being absent in Toy Story 3 because she was already whisked off to a new owner by the time they were all grown up, as toys usually end up being. That of course is where we have the prequel flashback at the start of the film that comes into the lead up of events to explain her disappearance, as did she remain an important character in Woody's life in the last 2 films, which kickstarts the entire message of the film, where she accepts it because it's time for the next kid, as that phase of life is represented by what would go on in 3, where the dynamic of this movie is leaning in to move on for a toy, which I've always talked about initially, or many others, as the problem of what Toy Story 4 was presented with in regards to its story. Because we have to note, during the same period of in-between Toy Story was that period of Disney animation where you had films like Ralph Breaks the Internet to Frozen 2 having main characters encouraged to leave their sense of duty or purpose as main characters for good or bad reasons, and mostly bad reasons because they actually work. Because let's be honest, we saw Vanellope leave her own game for a new online game, which was stupid considering the lessons of the original, plus the fact she was the main face of her very game on the side of the natural leader of Sugar Rush and as president, where she decides to just leave for something more thrilling, forgetting the facts that she became the main facet of the game for something online that would probably disappear in today's environment or get shut down because of corporate gaming decisions or upkeep. Not logical. Whereas in the case of Frozen 2 was Elsa, the Queen of Arendelle herself, who just straight up leaves her people for the forest on some arbitrary nonsense of her being the 5th element spirit that connects to the force, or whatever you want to call it. That she was called to this voice to be the protector and she cannot be queen anymore. That not even 3 years after ruling, she just hands it off to her younger, more naive sister to run the government as queen. The wrong type of message of empowerment, where you're just sending the wrong signals to children that royal leaders can abdicate, is a fine thing to do if you're trying to find your calling or voice. Still looking back on that, that is a very wrong and gross message to be teaching or showing anyone, because in reality, reactions to abdications of royal duty or governmental works are not actually looked upon fondly, because the message of Frozen already accepted her as the queen with ice powers and special gifts as the way she was, a queen that just happens to have special ice powers and was accepted at the end because of it. Where the second film taught that she should have just straight up left, something that's more equivalent to a popular leader just leaving for no good reason other than to pursue their own voice. Something I would like to call the opposite of a George Washington type, where the people of Arendelle really didn't even get a say in that choice, which again shows the messy production of Frozen's story, showing nothing was really quality about their decisions. And And on that side, my criticisms still remain very valid because as a leader, your duty is to the people, and it's like the film really didn't want to lean into duty, saying that in the choice of Frozen 2, one only has to look at reality in the reactions to those like King Edward VIII's abdication that was shocking, betrayal, and angry by many at the time because of the circumstances. But then again, we are not here to talk about that at all. This is just me ranting about the logic of Frozen 2. But you do get the point of me bringing up these two characters as leaders that abandon their people for arbitrary follow your dreams reasons or voices in your head. Disney thinking that this was the best story to tell, and how apparently for Pixar it almost seemed like they were on the same path for Woody as he leaves the gang and Bonnie. But retrospective, Toy Story 4 wasn't the same case, unlike where you had Pixar that excels at its own definitions again, but how there was just some factors that made it bad for its time, and still to some degree. Because the reason Woody leaves is not done out of pure will. I mean it was, but it wasn't the Elsa Vanellope path, and more deliberation and encouraged mainly by Buzz and the other half of the Toy Story heroes to allow Woody to go off when almost everyone rejoined everyone else, but didn't because of love of Bo Peep and defining purpose. But the other problem I've had with that and others was the circumstances leading up to the characters that got there. For example, the main frame was the fact that Bonnie wasn't valuing Woody anymore, and that was true from the very first facts of the movie, and they made not so subtle visuals to affirm that choice. One of course was mainly on the promise Bonnie gave to Andy, or that Andy said to Bonnie in 3 to keep watch over Woody since he chose to leave back then, and let those like Andy finally grow up on their own. Which for fans, this was not the best choice that could have been made, because again, we would have rather seen Bonnie to actually care more about Woody, and they chose like that wasn't the fact that she wanted later on in her life. Like the broader picture, alongside those other two, were setting up a narrative that made it okay for these choices of characters to be justified to leave later, and I really couldn't find myself agreeing with that decision. However, I do now look back on it with a pragmatic mix, that some people play with toys differently over time, and we saw that with how Bo Peep had dealt with it at the start of the film, where there's nothing preventing me or you from not caring or stopping to play with certain toys no matter what we say or do, which is just in human nature, and something I kind of value from the director's commentary for back then.
This idea just came from the truth, which is my daughter has a Jessie doll and she loves it. She also has a Woody doll, she doesn't play with it as much. We're just thinking, well, that would happen.
Yeah, kids play with their toys differently, and it just illustrates that the situation for Woody is so much different than what he's used to.
That some of the point is that girls and boys do play with toys a lot differently, and there's a lot of makeup that goes into these decisions, and how it's frankly realistic to go through the perspective again, and how it's the broader point of how much Woody tries to be there for Bonnie, which is still commendable, unlike the other two, of how he sticks by that fact and purpose until the very end of the movie, as his choice still is even disagreeable to how they went about it with both Bonnie's character, or the questions of where even Woody would be if they're still present. This is where you have to realize again that Toy Story 4 is mainly about Woody in this film. When you revisit the choices and its framing of how does the old dog live with something new, when he speaks greatly about being Andy's toy, being there for most of his life more than any other, and how we've seen that impact on kids for a long time, and generations that come after it. Where also interesting enough, going back on the context, this actually does set up a greater role for Jessie in 5 than she does here in 4, which she really doesn't have a presence, where it's mainly about Woody, Bo Peep, and then Buzz. Also, other than that, was the creation of Forky, which is one of the most powerful moments in the film that sets up how toys come to life and Woody's new perspective and purpose in life to help him be there for Bonnie in the film. A turning point of where he has to do something new to care about the charting his own path, where he literally makes it his job to keep Forky near Bonnie as much as possible, to value Bonnie's creation for Bonnie, rather than lead with Bonnie to play with him at all. Sure, you can chalk it up with the first half of him trying to be here so he can get played with, and Bonnie all after that enjoying sleeping near her with Forky on accident, but that's just as far as it goes, where the focus is on the plastic utensil, which sets up something greater for Woody in that regard. I did some criticisms of that beforehand, but when you go back and look at certain sequences and through that commentary, you see that Woody's purpose still remains to be true, that he cares until the end. After all that comes the part where the RV travels and Forky leaves, where Woody has to chase him down, which sets up this half of the film with the shop, where we finally see two main characters, with Bo Peep yet again back in the picture, tossing with Gabby Gabby. And the reason we have to actually mention these two side by side is the fact that these two characters bring up different new perspectives, one with the new toy being Gabby, who wants to be likable to an owner by having a new voice box, and the other portion of how people have mixed mixed feelings about Bo Peep being this new independent voice. And yes, this can be something that most people have mixed feelings on versus how you feel about the original Bo Peep of the kindly sheepmaid she was as Woody's girlfriend, and now how she appears all the time free-spirited as she is. But just calling her independent girl boss is a naive frame to her nature of how it can actually be more framed in a new purpose for her life in helping other people after going from owner to owner since Andy, which for Toy Story at its time, after everything you did after the original trilogy, actually does seem like a logical step to do so, because what can be wrong to be said about her character arc leveling up if her experience and purpose of helping other toys find owners in playgrounds or wherever they may find themselves that is done for purely good reasons. And this is something that's great because it clashes with Woody's philosophy about Toy's purpose about himself, which happens to be Toy Story's biggest point since the original, when it was mainly going through Woody's arc about him being selfish and learning to grow what a toy's purpose really is. And that's why when you look back more in Toy Story 4 and within 5's context of change, is that this is exactly where it should have been headed. Where do you go when you grow up or change as a person as much as any toy would? Another commendable thing on Woody's part here is still the ability for him to be steadfast in his beliefs. Not that he really hates anyone that he's a part of or any society he's framed in unless it's a villain, but how he sticks by his beliefs or people until the end that is fulfilled. Like Toy Story doesn't shy away from Woody's personal thoughts or feelings, and they make it front and center. It's not the first time he almost got caught up and left because he was with Jesse and Pete, and that whole era back in 2 he would have abandoned even Andy during that time, but how he grew into learning what he was and how he still is done with more nuance that said he'll be there until he feels like he's not wanted or that purpose is fulfilled. And Toy Story 4 does a good job with all of its characters old and new and lent into the perspectives that made it a key statement to how certain toys react to their situations, both past and no past. This movie also makes it a strong point that rejection does exist in toys, especially in Gabby's case after all the struggle that she went through to get to Woody's voice box, after his own regret lashing out at his rigid behavior. Like seeing the moments of characters like Harmony that she was building now rejected sets something off new to a point that shows that not everyone is the same. There are people who deserve happiness or toys that they can play with, and that is the true purpose of a toy, to not be stuck doing the same thing, but how you were meant for something else. Again, not everyone likes to play with toys, they can be picky, they can choose this or that, and that is a real perspective that Toy Story 4 showed. The toy's rules are consistent in what the purpose of a toy should be, to be there for owner, for a child that deserves such happiness in their life, and this point shows how there is so much more than just what one person can do. And that's the mirror point in Gabby that proves to Woody that he doesn't necessarily need to stick with Bonnie. Now this still doesn't actually mean that I have to agree with that decision because of the same caveats, and I still really don't do on behalf of this sequel, but it doesn't mean I cannot see that now in that value in a choice like this, where I'm more on the side of Woody needing to go as a necessity for the story to continue. And anyone can agree or disagree with my frame, and that's the beauty of it. This franchise has always been about what they can do for us rather than what we could do for them, since it's always been the purpose of toys to be there for their owners. Nothing remotely changed Woody or anyone else to think otherwise, and we can't say we don't need them and they don't need us, as that was never the point of 4 and it still remains to be true. The great proof of this is validated when Gabby goes off to help this lost girl who doesn't know where her parents are, and she's scared, where she accepts her as comfort and confirms what she needed, and that worked. And Woody and the others feel satisfied seeing that payoff, which makes his decision more easier to do than what he initially set to do after he left Bo and rejoined the game. Again, Woody's attitude also shows that his choice was a hard one, not a sure one, where unlike the other two characters that never really gave a second thought to their choices of either staying or going, Woody shows that he was never sure of that unless the other characters actually gave him a go. He was the only one to show that he literally had the most conflict going with them if that was the okay decision or not, just like what the director said in this part here.
And this is really important. I think that Woody and Buzz's relationship, this is the only way he would stay with Bo, is having Buzz give permission for him to stay. He's so loyal to his kid. We've seen that over so many films. He's only going to do it when he knows that Bonnie is going to be okay and his friends are going to be okay and that it is the right thing for him. he finally gets to do something for himself.
And when you look at this choice, you begin to understand that Woody made a difficult one, but how it was the right one for him, since toys like Buzz already knew that Bonnie was going to be okay. Bonnie already showed, no matter how hard you can hate or disagree with it, that she doesn't really need Woody to be safe or okay. Forky and the others was the new avenue, and that he can move on if it's okay with the others, which it was. Not saying that this was the greatest or good path to get there because of the flaws of the broader stories, but it's one that feels the most okay to be justified. It's not about Woody just running off to be with his girlfriend, it's about leveling up his role that doesn't betray his character, which never meant at any point that he never gave up on Bonnie, just like he never gave up on Andy, despite the moments of anyone else he fights for that has to be shared, and that opportunity he hasn't forgotten. Again, in both cases, at the end of 3 and at the end of 4, he makes that rational decision of his own nature. He never stopped loving Bonnie, he never stopped loving Andy, despite such circumstances. And plus, with this caveat, nobody can deny that this ending isn't emotional, with Buzz and Woody hugging, especially now within the context of Jessie's role for her getting the mantle as sheriff for Bonnie, as she did value to play with her more at the start of this film, and also the narrative of 5 that makes her more center role against the situation there, which is something that is very meaningful to have, where the work really is never done. It continues for infinity and beyond. And after films like Toy Story 3, you couldn't attempt to top that ending without doing something as impactful at those moments that are gained by the hard choices, and still acts very emotional and connectful to its core audience. And nobody has ever really said, or it's ever noted, that anything they did abandoned or made Toy Story such a bad film. It's actually a proof that Toy Story's mark on the world has not made anyone feel bad, but felt really good about their lives. Because if they never actually did that, then what would be the case of even watching these movies at all? Toy Story just remains to be that constant that no matter how much they do, they will always find a way to make it continue in its heart and never lose sight of what is important in a child's heart, nor an adult's mind, where it will continue on no matter which era we are in, as long as imagination is left to give and purpose is struck in every soul imaginable. We may disagree on the fundamentals of stories like this, but we can always count on it to have a friend like them for infinity and beyond. I'm all done. Goodbye.